Welcome back to HANA Basics for Developers. In this video, we want to talk about the important topic of logging, and specifically audit logging. So let's just go ahead and dive in. I've already prepared some solutions that will include hooks to the audit logging service, and we'll see how we can use that in our code, but also how we can configure and activate the audit log from the HANA Cockpit, as well as view the audit logging entries. Now, let's just starting from the basics. Why do we need to log? And of course, there's different types of logging. Sometimes we just want to log to record errors, situations, to help in the tracing of program flow. So basically, a flow of troubleshooting. And for that, you might have noticed, if we look at our service module and we look at the package JSON, that we actually have two packages here that kind of sound similar. We've got an SAP logging package and we've got an SAP audit logging package. Now, they're quite different in the scope of what they make possible. The SAP logging package is for basic troubleshooting kind of logging. Okay? So this SAP logging, it doesn't require any special resources to be defined in your project. It doesn't actually write the content into the database. The logging is really very similar to if you would do a console.log. It's just going to write either into standard out or standard error under the file system of your particular application. So at the Node.js level, it's just going to go into the app specific logs. It of course can be viewed from the log console that you see here in the web IDE. It can also be monitored from the XSA admin cockpit. So let's look at a little example here. So the SAP logging. If I come here, for instance, to my Bootstrap, we do create an instance of the SAP logging. So I'm just creating a logging object. And then you have to create an application context. And actually, I've got a little stuff left over here from when I was playing around, but let's just go ahead and take that out. We create an application context for the logger. And then this is another SAP module that is integrated into Express in a pretty nice way. When we initialize Express, we can also pass in the logging as a middleware, giving it the application context that we created earlier, and tell it whether we want to log network information as well. And what will happen is Express will actually, on each request response, will automatically create a logger for us and put information from the request object into it. So we'll have access to, like the IP address, the referrer, even the SAP passport will be processed and brought into the logging context. So when we're ready to use this logger in our own code, if we come here and we look at, I've got some examples here. What we can do is we can just like we use the middleware with Express, and inside the request object with the HDB ext, we got our database connection already established for us. Basically have the logging context already established for us. It's added to the request object, and we can simply get a specific logger or tracer. Difference being there, the use case, the logger is meant to log errors and other conditions that you want to record, whereas the tracer is more about recording the flow of your application to help in troubleshooting scenarios. And what we see here is we can also assign specific context. For instance, we might create a logger that is application specific as opposed to network or interface. And for the tracer, we generally make those file specific. And what that allows us to do is set the log or trace level, different levels, like warning, info, error, debug, and we can set that per context, so that we don't always have to turn on logging or tracing for our entire application, but we can do it for specific parts of our application. Because if you turn on, like the other day, I turned on the debugger level of logging, but I did it at the application level, and I got so much information from the from Express and from all the surrounding layers that I was just overwhelmed. It was too much information, and actually, it even slowed down the log display so much it became unusable. So it's very important to be able to set the logging command, and we can do this at the command line parameter. Pardon me. If I log into the XS admin or XS command line here, and I just look at the commands, you'll see up here under application, there's set logging level, unset logging level, list logging levels. The set logging level allows you to set the logger for not just a single application, but also the specific context. So if I look here, like list logging levels, XS, and I have to get an app here. So let me grab my app. List logging levels for my app. You'll see, for instance, what did I do wrong there? List logging levels, or LLL. Maybe I'll just use the short command so I don't screw this up again. Oh, list logging levels. There we go. And what you see for my application is I've set logging levels for my application component 1 to be info level. So I dropped it down from the default, which is error, and I've raised the logging level to specifically for HANA Client.js to debug. And what we see here is that I basically get the logger and tracer, and I pass it into a query command here. But for instance, on the error, and I have a query here that will intentionally produce an error. I'm selecting from a table or view that doesn't exist. So when we catch an error, we're going to go ahead and say logger error. That's going to tell it the level that it appears at, and then I'm just going to stringify the error message and write it out to the log. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. And basically the tracer, I'm just saying what I'm doing in my flow, that tracer catching an error, or tracer exiting the query. So just to show your program flow. Now we can see these the logger information in the XS admin console. So for instance, let's go ahead and run this. And let's go down the path that will produce our error message. Node client error. So that produced my error message. But now if I come to the XS admin console, the XS administration cockpit, and if we drill into our space on our application, and then per application we can view the logs. We can even, what we'll see here, if we go down to the bottom of the log, is we see our entry here, and it's written out much nicer than just the standard console log, because we get additional information here. We set the type, log, the date and time stamp that it was an error, what was the context, it came from application, that GUID there, and then the actual error message. And that allows us to do a couple things. This is a standard logging format, so it can be parsed and processed by external tools as well. We have the ability here, we could filter. Maybe I only want to see application messages, and I only want to see ones that have been logged. So now I've narrowed this down, and you see I've ran this test multiple times here. So it allows us to filter in the log view and not just see all the junk that's being dumped out to the console or standard out by maybe different modules. And as I said, it gives us additional information that can be parsed as well. But this is, as I said, transitory. These are written to the file system. They can be lost if the file system gets wiped out in a disaster. They get pruned after a period of time. This is not meant to be persisted permanently. So really this should not be used for any kind of security tracking, or audit logging. If we want to have an audit of who did what, for security purposes, if we have sensitive data, if we have calls coming from the outside and we want to log where they're coming from, so maybe we can trace back if we, get an attack, if somebody does something they shouldn't, any kind of those scenarios, we want a more robust storage method than just writing them out to files on the file system. We want to store that in the database in a protected format. We want to put security around it so you need extra security to be able to read the audit log, so not just every developer and administrator can come read it, as we would with the troubleshooting logs, as you see here. So for that purpose, we have the completely separate concept of the audit log, okay? And what we've done, originally the audit log in XSA was kind of separate from the HANA audit log. HANA has this concept of I can configure an audit log and I can write rules and I can say what I want audited, and we don't have to put extra hooks into our SQL commands, our inserts. We can dynamically attach audit rules to certain tables, certain users, and things like that. And then it goes to a secure log location, and you need extra security to be able to view that audit log. We get the same sort of thing from the application server layer as well, but in order for this to work, we need a couple extra layers here. And what you'll see if I come and look at my project itself, I've declared an additional resource for this audit log. So you see here, it is its own type of resource, audit log, service plan, free, and then I've bound this audit log service to my Node.js or my XSJS modules. So you see it here, the OpenSAP EX log is attached here to my service module. It's actually attached here to my XSJS module as well, if we see it. And for XSJS, what we have to do if we want audit logging is we just have to adjust the bootstrap and load the audit log service, just like we would the HANA database service or the UA service, and then it will automatically be processed and utilized by the XSJS compatibility layer. Sort of the same thing going on here with the with pure Node.js. We have a separate audit logging module. You see it here. So we don't use the logging module, we use the audit logging module. And I have prepared an example of how we could use that as well. I've created a little separate route here to test this audit logging. So what we see here is we use XS environment to basically load the audit log configuration from the bound resource. And then we pass that information into the initialization of the audit logging module. And it will pass us back either an error if we could not establish a connection to the audit log or the audit log instance. And then from the audit log instance, basically we can issue different message types. For instance, I'm issuing a security message. I'm going to say, I'm just making up a scenario here, unsuccessful logon attempts. And I can take information from like the request object. In this case, I'm going to say by. That's going to be the external user ID. We can record the external IP address. We pass that in. Now the audit logging library doesn't have functionality to pull this stuff in automatically from the request object, which is why I had to do some parsing here of the request headers to get the IP address. But it takes care of storage of this information and the formatting of the information. So I'm not having to know the internal format, know the database tables where it's stored. An audit log administrator can configure how and where this is stored. We'll go see that in a minute. And this may not get recorded at all. If nobody's configured audit logging, if it's disabled for a particular system, this is going to do nothing. But I put the hooks in my code so that it's accessible if the audit logging is configured. So if we want to enable this as a audit log administrator, I would go to the HANA Cockpit. And I would go into my particular system. So let's go to the system DB. And here's where I can configure the audit logging. So right now my audit logging is turned off. I do have one policy that I created. Let's go ahead and look at this policy. I created it in advance for XSA. And basically, if I drill into this policy, what you see here is you have these options to write these rules, but basically you choose your audit actions. Let's put this in edit mode so I can show you the different audit actions. So like we could come here and we could say add actions. And application auditing, this is where the 4 XSA level actions go. So these are the different types of messages that we could write with the XSA audit log module that I showed you. We're doing security events, but you could also track personal data modification, personal data access, or configuration changes. And the XSA runtime itself will also write to the audit log. You'll see it writing to configuration changes and security events. If we want to put the hooks into our own application, depending on which method that we call of the audit log, that's going to put us into these different categories. You can see there's many other audit logging things. There's a lot of system level things that we could audit, user role management, structured privilege management. We can log, basic SQL operations, things like that as well. But for now, we're just going to keep the application audit logging. You also see that you can configure successful or unsuccessful. Maybe we're only interested in when an audit log fails. What audit logging level do we want to set? I'm going to set it to info here, and we're going to log all so we can see most everything. You can choose whether you want to send it to the system log, a database table, CSV text file, or into the kernel. If you're going to write to the database tables, then you can also delete entries automatically, and you can set your retention period. So you can set up all kinds of rules here. We're obviously not having to code any of this into our applications. That's what's so nice about this audit logging. We're not having to worry about setting up our own logging tables, writing into them, cleaning them up. This will all be managed by the system for you. We can also say specific objects that we want to audit. Maybe you want to only set certain target objects. That doesn't really apply here in the XSA audited actions, but if you had SQL kind of actions, then you could narrow it to certain schemas, certain tables, and which users as well. So I can narrow this down by user. I'm going to keep it with all users. So you set up these rules. I've created this policy or rule named XSA. It is enabled currently, but auditing overall in my system is disabled. So what we want to do here is we want to go back and we want to enable auditing overall on the system. So I'll just say in the cockpit that I want to turn on auditing. And now our audit log policy will be enforced. So if I would come back here and run my application that is set up here for the audit log, node audit log, and then I've got just this one example in here. So it's written to the log now that I've triggered it. And if I would come back to the HANA Cockpit, this is where I view the log as well. So I could come in here into Auditing, and I could go to the audit trail. And it breaks it out to HANA specific logs, XSA logs, or all logs. I haven't turned on anything for the HANA logging. But if I come here to the all logs, and I see I'm getting some XSA information, and it was, we can see the type here. Actually, my newest is on top, so the one that I just ran. You can see I did some testing the other day as well. But we can see the info, the level, successful, the host, the username who triggered it, my message, 3 unsuccessful login attempts. The rest of the information, like the IP address and everything, that would be here in additional information. So you come here, for instance, and turn on some additional columns that aren't on by default. For instance, let's see. We can see the XS Advanced Application user, the IP address, the internal UUID for the XS application. So, we were trapping this application user. It was being trapped automatically. The user that's connecting to write the audit log, the external IP address being trapped there as well. Here you see some other information from an earlier one being written out. This one was actually being triggered by one of the built-in actions as well. It didn't come from my command. Now we can view this nicely here in the auditing tool of the HANA Cockpit. The other option that we have is we could go to the Database Explorer and view this as well. If you have the proper rights, of course we would need the rights there. But if I go to the system DB and I would look at views, and let's just search the views for audit. And what we see here is we have an all audit log view, we have an audit log view, we have an XSA audit log view. So I could also view this at the SQL level. If I would come here and I would say open data on XSA audit log, then I'm going to see the entries here rather than through the tooling. So you really have multiple options. I can get to it directly from the database views, but I could also use the HANA Cockpit view. So I hope this has shown you the different types of loggings that we have. Some that might be used for more interactive troubleshooting kinds of scenarios, for tracing when something goes wrong, and then others that are more of a security, long-term auditing. We've explored the differences between the two different APIs, the technical differences, and also the 2 different ways that we can view and interact with the different types of logging data as well.